Tell our audience a little bit about what happened when you tried to reach out to a contact at a major media organization. What happened when you tried to share your concerns?
Yeah, I actually ended up with a connection to somebody who worked with 60 Minutes, and I don't think it's wrong to say who I was talking to. And I do know people who are in the film industry and media. I also reached out to other people. I reached out to somebody who's actually done some tremendous documentary work. And it took me 2 years of working with these people and sending information. They were very interested at the beginning. And this was actually before the pandemic, 2, 3 years before. So things hadn't even changed as much as they are now. I saw what was progressing and I saw the way things were going. And I felt like it had to be out in the public and people had to be educated because people were going to die. This is not being doomsdayish. I'm not over dramatizing it. This is reality. So they were actually very interested. And I went through giving them all sorts of statistics, all sorts of information, by the way, going against the narrative that the AAMP has put out there, that their outcomes are equivalent, because they are not. They are not equivalent. And the outcomes that they're talking about were studies done in the old days when I started with nurse practitioners. And they were done with physician supervision. So if you have physician supervision of every case, of course, the outcomes are going to be good, and they were used well. So 2 years of time talking back and forth and talking back and forth. And we got to the point where they were starting to really going to create a program, and they were sort of going back and forth. Well, how can we approach it and what can we say? Then I stopped hearing from them. Then they dropped off. This is both cases, the documentary and 60 Minutes. I stopped being contacted. I stopped having responses to my emails, responses to my calls. Finally, I got a response, and both sides said the exact same thing, which was where we had started the conversation. And the start of the conversation was, but I really love my nurse practitioner. My friend went to a nurse practitioner and she was the one who explained everything. And in the end, they came back to me and said, well, we don't feel like we can sell this because, TV is selling, films are selling, because people like nurse practitioners. And it made me want to cry.
Yeah, I just wanted to read a little bit of this letter that you shared that came from one of your contacts at one of those organizations. It was so interesting because they wrote that they understood where you were coming from, and they said, I really always have your story in mind because it is not only interesting but very disconcerting. It's an obvious, tangible indication that healthcare is sliding downhill, and it may be a long time before it gets the coverage it deserves. But then they go on to say, but I also understand why the traditional media is balking at it. The story is critical of nurse practitioners, and people don't want to have their confidence in their healthcare providers undermined. So that's one. Then they also said they also think doctors are too arrogant until, of course, they need a good one, and then they deify them. In the end, we don't really want to hear bad news. We just want to be mad at people who don't fix these hidden things that might harm us. But I thought that was so fascinating because we are getting very similar feedback with Physicians for Patient Protection. We hired a Hollywood showrunner, producer, to create a sizzle reel, and we shared some of the things from the first book, From Patients at Risk, and also some of the stories that came out in Imposter Doctors, which was patients being harmed by egregious mismanagement. And our producer was really excited, and he was so enthusiastic and so confident that he was going to sell this sizzle reel, that it was going to be turned into a documentary miniseries. Because when he read and he heard all this information, he was a layperson, but the more he learned and dug into it, he realized that this is a huge story that really people need to hear. And then he pitched it, and he got feedback that said, and then he pitched it again. And over and over again, he heard the same thing that they told you, Sara, which was, people don't really want to hear that. Isn't it just a turf war? And, there are bad nurse practitioners, but there are bad doctors. They didn't want to accept or hear the big picture, which is now there are almost 500,000 nurse practitioners or physician assistants, and there's about 1 million physicians. And in about half the states of the union, non-physicians can practice completely independently without a physician. It's not a turf war. It's about patients having the right information to make the best decisions for their healthcare. But the media just does not want to share any of the negative side.
The AAMP has done an amazing job of PR, and physicians are not into PR. This is the thing. We have not been media people. We're people who do our job diligently and work incredibly hard, which is another thing. I could go on about the nurse practitioners, saying I'm working so hard when they're seeing only 20 patients in the day and we're seeing 40 to 60. And they're complaining, and they literally make more than, especially the pediatricians coming out of residency who've done 5, 6, 7 years, depending on their specialty. And I don't know. It's very, very, very frustrating.
Well, I think you're right. And I think we have to give a lot of credit to them. But I will say that our organization, which we thank you for supporting, we have hired a public relations team. We've had them in place for 2 years. We've had a few articles that have gotten picked up. But honestly, in the last, I'd say 3, 4, 5 months, it's been crickets. We pitch every time we see an article. There was the child that died in Texas when the nurse practitioner didn't send them for further care. The child had sickle cell anemia. And that was a big story, or should have been. And there was one report about it, and we pitched it for further discussion as far as, should we look at whether they should be in this role? And no media organization touched it. And eventually, I think they're not going to be able to continue to ignore this issue, because, when the wrong or right person, whatever you think about it, the important person gets hurt, then I think that's where people will say, how come nobody told us that this could happen?
Maybe, like I said, because the problem is the amount of funding that they have for AAMP, heart of a nurse. Who has not heard that line, heart of a nurse? Meaning we don't have hearts. But they say heart of a nurse, brain of a doctor. Come on. Why are we the ones doing turf war? This isn't a turf war. This is us crying out for what we see. And this is not isolated. I mean, you're bringing forward people who die. However, it's day in and day out. Day in and day out, I'm seeing the problems. I try and refer to a specialist, and I'm sent a letter back by a nurse practitioner who knows way less than I do and gives me less information. And not only that, it's wrong and often interferes with the process that I'm going through. That's just a single entity. This is happening everywhere. And people aren't conscious because they won't introduce themselves as nurse practitioners anymore either. So people think they're seeing physicians.
If you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to get the book, Patients at Risk, and the follow-up, Imposter Doctors. And if you're a physician and you'd like to learn more about getting involved, join our group. It's called Physicians for Patient Protection. Our website is physiciansforpatientprotection.org.